many Oxford dons does it take to change a light bulb? Change? Change? Who mentioned change? Well, Jovan at the beginning suggested to us that we should be looking at the relationship between convention and innovation. And since I am in part affiliated to Oxford, I'm going to be extremely conventional and object to the notion of change and choose a topic which at its heart has not changed at all, namely the unsaid in language, the role of implicit communication in diplomacy. But since I'm also affiliated to Diplo, I'm going to bring innovation into the very heart of it, and my thesis is that it is in the unsaid, in the gaps, in the nooks, in the crannies, and the little secrets of what has not been said explicitly that there is most scope for change, for interpretation and reinterpretation. So the unsaid is what offers us potential for change and innovation. Now, why resort to the unsaid? The first reason is to keep your options open. To sit on the fence, not to commit to one position or another, and thereby to buy yourself time, to buy yourself space. That may be frustrating because it looks like fudging, but it's very typically diplomatic because it allows you perhaps to improve your options. A second reason for resorting to the unsaid is deniability. If you haven't said it explicitly, you can't be accused of anything, no matter how strongly you may have implied it and led people to believe it. And we've all come across that frustration. A third reason for resorting to the unsaid is consideration. If you were to tell me, you're fat, you're ugly, you're incompetent and stupid, you may very well be right. But I wouldn't speak to you after this session, and you'd get nothing out of me, ever. And therefore, if we were all to be frank and open and say what we thought, we'd probably all be at war. Stop nodding your head, Alex. We've moved on to the next proposition. Another reason beyond consideration, and this is a very important one, is persuasion. We do a better job of persuading people if we lead them to their own conclusions than if we tell them what to do. So diplomacy and the game of persuasion is very much about getting the other party to have your way. And that involves very often giving them just the tip of the iceberg and letting them infer the rest from what you have told them. And a final reason to resort to the unsaid is to build a community, to create a sense of the in-group, because there's nothing more cohesive than a group of people who don't need to explain themselves to each other because they share the same language, the same conventions, the same cultural reference points, the same sense of humor. In other words, they are comfortable with the unsaid because they don't need to articulate it and explain it. So these are a number of reasons why we resort to the unsaid. But before I go further, I want to make clear that we share the same definition of the unsaid. Now, there are lots of areas in language where we either cannot or must not or should not or do not say things. What we cannot say is possibly ineffable, or perhaps we are not up to the task of articulating it. What we must not say is either taboo or our brief tells us not to say it. What we should not say possibly causes offense. What we need not say is possibly already understood, or if we're being manipulative, we are seeking to let the other party think they have understood what we have wanted them to understand, and there is scope for tremendous influence and power in this kind of persuasiveness. Now, what I would like to do today is, first of all, simply because I believe always in grounding whatever I have to say in empirical data. I am, after all, a linguist, not a diplomat or a philosopher. I'd like to look at 4 categories of the unsaid, and then zoom out and ask, what's the relevance of studying the unsaid, first to diplomacy, secondly to diplomacy today, in an age of transparency, where speed and volume and openness is the name of the game. So bear with me as I identify 4 types of silence for you. Now, the unsaid is not any old silence. It's not an open-ended silence. It's a meaningful silence which is created and constrained by language. There are other types of silence, but the one that I'm interested, that I call the unsaid, or implicit communication, is created and constrained by language. It's meaningful. And within that category, what you find is things like gaps. Gaps are the most obvious of these silences. Gaps between words, for instance. If I say, let me see, climate security, am I talking about security of the climate against human emission, or am I talking about security of human beings against climate change? Adaptive or mitigating climate policy. Both are potentially contained in that one compound term. If I talk about public diplomacy, is it diplomacy by the public, for the public, with the public, or what's the relationship between the public and diplomacy? In English, the gap doesn't need to be articulated. In other languages, it does. If I talk about a headache pill versus a long life pill, is it the same dynamic between the modifier and the head pill? No. One gets rid of a headache, the other procures long life, doesn't get rid of it. If I talk about gunboat diplomacy, ping-pong diplomacy, shuttle diplomacy, is the relationship between the modifier and the head the same? No. There is a gap. You're having to fill that gap. You do it automatically, but you can do it misguidedly, or you can be misguided intentionally into filling it wrongly, okay? There are not only gaps between words, there are gaps between sentences, and they too can be filled in the same way, must be filled. If I say, the president entered, the journalist quickly left, I haven't said the context, I haven't explained the relationship, but you've all inferred that the journalist left because the president entered. If a church notice says, don't let despair kill you, let the church help. You probably, okay, one of you, two of you have understood where the church has gone wrong. It has gone wrong by not noticing the gap that it has left between those sentences and allowing you to fill it in the most obvious way, which is that the church in this case will help kill you, right? Parataxis, as it is called, has got a central role to play in diplomacy. You know that a large percentage of the American population believed that Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11. How did they come to that belief? Well, they were led to it, rather cynically, through the constant repetition of juxtaposed sentences, the first of which said Saddam Hussein is a threat to our nation, the second of which said 9/11 caused us to revise our national security policies. And I have a list of these juxtaposed sentences, Saddam Hussein, 9/11, Saddam Hussein, 9/11, and you are invited to bridge the gap and make Saddam Hussein responsible for 9/11. It serves a purpose, it's easily done, it's very persuasive. On the other hand, when the German Minister for Justice claimed that Bush was diverting attention from his domestic problems. This was a classical tactic. It was one that Hitler used. The heavens came down on the woman. She had to resign. There was a huge diplomatic fallout. Why? Because the Bush administration claimed that she had made an equation between Bush and Hitler, and Europe was going to be made to pay for it. This was a way of diplomatically signaling disapproval with anybody who disapproved of American foreign policy regarding Iraq at the time. It was just prior to the invasion. So parataxis involves the gap between sentences and can be and has been used in foreign affairs in interesting ways. But there are other ways of inserting gaps into language. One of my favorite involves what's called scope ambiguity. So for instance, if I say old chairs, tables and carpets, you will understand that all of them are old. If I say old men, women and children, you will reanalyze the scope of old. If the Olympic Charter says that there are no political demonstrations allowed in any Olympic areas, and then gets revised in 2007, just before the Chinese Olympics, to say no political protests in any Olympic sites, venues, or other areas. Why the revision? Well, because with the insertion of additional material, the scope of Olympic may stretch to other areas, but need not. And therefore, Chinese policemen can monitor the torch in various cities around the world, and Tibet is out, and Nepal are both, the Himalayas are out of bounds for any political protests. Insert material, create gaps, and in so doing, slip your message and your interpretation past unsuspecting people. But gaps are only one area of the unsaid that can be filled. There are other areas as well. Face space, as I call it, is another. And face space has to do with consideration, right? So, for instance, if I ask you, are you free on Thursday? And you tell me perhaps Friday would be better, I understand that no, Thursday you are not free. However, if I fail to get my antenna out and listen to what you've just said and listen to the meaning behind your words, I may think you're an awfully slippery customer who never says what you mean. And there, cultural differences, stereotyping, and prejudices may come into play. In fact, an awful lot of cultural misunderstanding arises from a failure to understand what are called indirect speech acts. These are the ways in which the words we say don't directly express the intention, the meaning that we have in mind. You all know the joke of what's the difference between a lady and a diplomat? Everybody knows it, please.
No.
Some of you don't know it?
No.
Oh dear. When a diplomat says no, he means maybe. When a diplomat says maybe, he means yes. And should a diplomat say yes, he's no diplomat. When a lady says no, she means maybe. When a lady says maybe, she means yes. Okay, and when a lady says, should a lady say yes, she's no lady. Sorry, you got the gist of it. I completely bungled the gist. But the idea is that simple words such as yes, no, and maybe can have different meanings from what they seem to have. And the importance for us with regard to face space is that the reason we tend not to say what we mean is that we don't want to impose on other people's space and threaten them. And as a species, a social species, we are very concerned with our standing in relation to each other. Our sense of self-worth has to be reflected in communities around us and their sense of our worth. And where a discrepancy arises, we feel a terrible discomfort. Politeness can be seen as a way of safeguarding the face of other people. And politeness is integrally present in our language. It's astonishing the extent to which, for instance, we use the past tense and the future tense to ask questions in order not to impose on people. I wanted to ask you a question. When? I want to ask it now, but I'm shunting it into the past tense so as not to impose on you now. Will you be going out? Would you like some milk? Will you sit down? Why am I using the future? Well, again, because I'd be imposing on you by using the present. So, face space is another form of unsaid, or a discrepancy between what is said and what is intended. Another area of the unsaid, a third, is what I call stories in a capsule. These are metaphors and connotations and idioms and allusions and myths and all the other reference points where we tell the tip of the iceberg and we let the person infer the rest of it. We have hundreds of metaphors at play. We saw several today with clouds and firewalls and roots and pain, spots of pain that needed to be cured. I'm looking here at the speaker. I was speaking over coffee just recently about metaphors of perception between East and West, and I think they're going to be elaborated on tomorrow. But for instance, to what extent is the crisis in Europe today contagious, or to what extent is it possibly a time bomb, right? These are different metaphors, and depending on which metaphor you choose, you will structure people's perception of the situation and their reaction to it, their conduct, and the policies that they endorse. Is health a fortress that needs to be defended, the body a fortress, or is it a time bomb that is going to explode of its own device or run out of it in its own time, right? That will determine health policies. Is peace a destination that you can achieve through a roadmap, or is it an abstract concept that has to be attained by other means? The metaphor you choose will determine the policies that you adopt. Hugely important in terms of social realities. We structure our social realities largely through the stories that we tell, and those stories are hidden in the metaphors and the connotations. Connotations, for instance, apartheid wall versus security fence denotes the same edifice in the world, tells a completely different story about it. Find something that you haven't thought about, like for instance, scary movies. Everybody knows of scary movies, everybody has an affectionate relationship to this particular cinematic genre. Call them terror porn, and suddenly you can feel your synapses reconnect and a whole new channel of thought emerge. Terror porn, oh well, maybe I won't be indulging in terror porn tonight after all, okay? So connotations tell different stories, just as metaphors do, just as idioms do, and even today there was a lovely one about if the only tool you have is a hammer, then you see nails everywhere, right? In fact, one of my favorite metaphors, come idioms, recently was in relation to the bankers' crisis, namely, bankers are wolves in bankers are wolves in shepherd's clothing. Okay, the fourth category is focus. The extent to which we zoom in or zoom out of a particular frame. Vagueness, for instance, is a fantastic way of not saying anything, or of redefining things to suit your interests. When the Israelis refer to a legitimate target and to proportionate force, who defines it? How vague are they going to be? And how self-serving is that definition going to be? Words like to sex up are ambiguous as to whether they include mendacity or not. Words like rendition are ambiguous as to whether they flout human rights or not. Simple words like sorry are ambiguous in English as to whether they include responsibility and therefore culpability or not. I'm sorry the weather's bad, it's not my fault. I'm sorry I hurt you, it probably is. 4 categories, you've got them. What's the relevance of what I've had to say? I thought I was going to get coloured cards to tell me. I feel cheated. Okay, what's the relevance of everything I've said? I think the unsaid is here to stay. Doesn't matter what happens at the level of technology. Now the question is, how should it be taught in diplomacy? Should it just be one subject along many other subjects on a vertical plane, or should it be a cross-cutting, horizontal, integral aspect of other subjects in negotiation and of potentially what our outlook and our underlying mindset is? These are the questions that I will leave you with. And